but participate, make suggestions, things like that. And even as a 6-year-old, I mean, my dad was having to read the lines at the read-through, and I would just kind of sit there at first. My father rants.
What does it really take to stay relevant in Hollywood for more than half a century? Not just famous for a moment, not just respected for a decade, but consistently trusted, liked, and chosen in an industry that quietly replaces people the second they become inconvenient. When you look at Ron Howard, the image that comes to mind is simple, calm, approachable, almost disarmingly polite. He's the guy who never seems rattled, the steady hand behind the camera, the former child star who somehow avoided the usual pitfalls. But that image, as comforting as it is, only tells you half the story. Because staying that steady in Hollywood doesn't happen by accident. It's forged through tension, pressure, and moments that would have pushed most people out of the business entirely. Howard didn't just grow up in front of the camera. He grew up navigating personalities that ranged from quietly distant to explosively intense. And in doing so, he learned something most people in Hollywood never fully grasp: how to endure without losing yourself. Long before he was directing award-winning films, Howard was just a kid trying to understand the strange emotional currents of a television set. On The Andy Griffith Show, he played the wide-eyed, sincere Opie, surrounded by adults who were supposed to represent warmth and familiarity. And for the most part, that illusion held, especially with figures like Andy Griffith, who brought genuine leadership and humor to the set. But then there was Frances Bavier, who, to audiences, embodied kindness as Aunt Bee. Off-camera, however, the atmosphere shifted. Bavier wasn't loud or explosive, and she was something far more confusing for a child: distant, formal, and emotionally closed off. She approached her work with the seriousness of a stage veteran who felt out of place in a light-hearted sitcom. That disconnect created a quiet tension that young Howard couldn't ignore. He was expected to perform affection and familial closeness with someone who, in reality, kept him at arm's length. For a child actor, that kind of emotional contradiction is more than uncomfortable. It's instructive. Howard began to realize that what audiences see and what actors feel are often completely different things. Bavier's professionalism was undeniable, but it came wrapped in a kind of detachment that forced him to adapt quickly. He learned that chemistry on screen isn't always natural. Sometimes it's constructed carefully and deliberately, even when the real-life relationship behind it feels cold. That early lesson stayed with him, shaping the way he would later direct actors, understanding that performances don't always reflect personal bonds, and that professionalism can exist even in emotionally disconnected environments. If Bavier introduced him to quiet tension, his encounter with Yul Brynner showed him the opposite extreme. Working as a very young child on the film The Journey, Howard found himself in the presence of a man whose reputation filled the room before he even spoke. Brynner carried himself with an authority that wasn't just confidence, it was dominance. Everything about him, from the way he moved to the way he looked at people, reinforced the idea that he was the center of gravity on set. For a 5-year-old, that kind of presence wasn't just intimidating, it was overwhelming. Howard watched as seasoned adults adjusted their behavior around Brynner, carefully navigating his expectations. It wasn't chaos or anger that defined the environment, it was control. Brynner didn't need to raise his voice. His disapproval alone could shift the entire mood. That experience revealed something crucial. A single personality, if powerful enough, can shape the emotional climate of an entire production. And while that kind of authority can produce striking performances, it can also suppress creativity, replacing collaboration with caution. For Howard, it was a glimpse into a version of Hollywood where hierarchy ruled everything and where fear, even subtle fear, could become part of the process. Years later, when Howard stepped behind the camera himself, and that memory lingered. He understood the cost of that kind of dominance and made a conscious decision to avoid it. His sets would become known for being collaborative and relaxed, not because he lacked authority, but because he understood how easily authority could turn into intimidation. Brenner showed him what power looked like when it went unchecked, and Howard chose a different path. By the time the early 1980s arrived, Howard was no longer the child observing from the sidelines. He was a young director trying to establish himself. And with that came a new kind of challenge, managing actors who didn't question whether they belonged, but questioned everything else. On the set of Night Shift, he worked with Shelley Long, a performer whose intelligence and dedication were both her greatest strengths and her biggest obstacles. Long approached her role with meticulous care, analyzing motivations, questioning lines, and pushing for deeper clarity in every moment. On paper, that sounds ideal, an actor fully invested in the craft. But in practice, it slowed everything down. Howard, coming from a background where efficiency mattered, found himself caught between respecting her process and maintaining momentum. Every additional question, every request for another take added pressure to a schedule that couldn't afford endless exploration. This wasn't conflict in the traditional sense. There were no outbursts or dramatic confrontations. Instead, it was a constant negotiation between precision and progress. Howard had to learn how to validate her need for understanding while still guiding the film forward. That experience marked a turning point. He realized that directing wasn't just about framing shots or guiding performances. It was about managing personalities, each with their own fears, habits, and expectations. Long wasn't trying to be difficult. She was trying to be certain. And that distinction mattered. Howard began to see that what looks like resistance is often a form of self-protection. Actors, especially talented ones, don't want to fail, and sometimes that fear expresses itself as control. Then came a completely different kind of challenge in A Beautiful Mind, where Howard worked with Russell Crowe. Crowe didn't slow things down. He intensified them. His approach wasn't analytical in a quiet sense. It was forceful, immersive, and relentless. He didn't just want to understand the character, he wanted to live inside it, and he expected the production to adapt accordingly. Now, conversations about scenes could stretch into long debates, each one charged with the weight of getting it exactly right. For Howard, this meant stepping into a more assertive version of himself. He couldn't rely solely on being agreeable. He had to hold his ground when necessary and recognize when to yield. One of the most significant moments came when Crowe pushed for a chronological shooting schedule, something that complicates production logistics. Initially resistant, Howard eventually saw the value in the request, not as a power move, but as a creative necessity for Crowe's process. That decision reflected a deeper understanding. Sometimes the best leadership isn't about control, but about knowing when someone else's instinct serves the story better. The collaboration was intense, occasionally exhausting, but ultimately transformative. Howard learned how to channel that intensity rather than resist it. He discovered that some actors bring chaos, not because they lack discipline, but because their commitment runs so deep, it disrupts everything around them. Managing that kind of energy requires patience, confidence, and a willingness to engage at the same level. Not every challenge, however, comes from creative intensity. Some come from unpredictability, And that's where figures like Tom Sizemore entered the picture. Sizemore's struggles with addiction introduced a completely different kind of tension, one that had less to do with performance and more to do with reliability. For a director, uncertainty is one of the most difficult obstacles to manage. It's not about whether a scene will work. It's about whether it can happen at all. And Howard found himself confronting the limits of empathy. He valued creating a supportive environment, but he also had a responsibility to the entire production. When one person's issues begin to affect hundreds of others, the equation changes. It becomes less about understanding and more about protection, protecting the schedule, the crew, and the project itself. That experience reinforced a hard truth. Not every problem can be solved through patience or kindness. Sometimes boundaries are necessary, even when they're difficult to enforce. And then there was perhaps the most personal challenge of all, one that didn't involve conflict in the usual sense. During his time on Happy Days, Howard experienced a shift that many actors never recover from. While he began as the central figure, and the show's cultural momentum gradually moved toward Henry Winkler. The character of the Fonz became a phenomenon, capturing attention in a way that reshaped the entire dynamic of the series. What made this situation unique was the absence of personal animosity. Howard and Winkler remained close, their friendship intact, but professionally, the shift was undeniable. Howard found himself navigating a new reality where his importance to the show was being quietly redefined. It wasn't about jealousy, it was about identity. Being replaced, even subtly, forces you to reconsider your place in the industry. Rather than resist the change, Howard used it as motivation. He began looking beyond acting, exploring directing as a way to regain control over his creative path. That decision would ultimately define his career, and turning a moment of displacement into an opportunity for reinvention. It was proof that sometimes the most significant growth comes not from conflict, but from being pushed out of a role you thought was permanent. Across all these experiences, a pattern emerges. Howard didn't avoid difficult people. He learned from them. Each encounter, whether quiet or explosive, added another layer to his understanding of how films are made and how people function under pressure. He saw how